I'm going to do a quick loom on the West Indies, okay? All right. So remember the Spice Islands? The Spice Islands were originally called the Indies. Well, at this moment in time, remember Christopher Columbus believed when he came over to the Caribbean, he believed that he was in these Indies. That's why he called them Indians. Today we call this area the West Indies, and the other Indies we call the East Indies. I hope that makes sense. But again, we're going to talk about the West Indies today. When we talk about the West Indies, we're talking about islands such as Cuba, Hispaniola, which has San Domingo, it has Haiti as well as Dominican Republic. We can even talk about the Bahamas and certain other islands. This is going to be this region here. When you look at this, there's going to be three things we're going to talk about really quickly. We're going to talk about the impact of plantation economies, the impact of sugar factories on the European economies, as well as the destruction of the local economies, and the importance of slavery and the cultural impact. So let's go ahead and get started. Number one, plantation economies. When the Europeans came into this region, they realized very quickly it was a wonderful place to have sugar cane farms. So they're going to import sugar. From understand, sugar it comes from India, and they're going to implement it right here. They're going to have plantations. Well, to have these plantations, they're going to disrupt the indigenous economies. When I look at the indigenous or native economies, you need to know a couple things. Number one, Native Americans didn't really own land. They believed the land in itself was owned by the gods, so therefore we were here to use it. So they would not change the environment. They wouldn't make fences. They didn't have ownership. They didn't do those aspects. Second thing I want to point out is the economies were based on nature. Animals roamed, the land developed naturally. Well, the Europeans saw this very differently. The Europeans, when they came here, they believed that the land, once they conquered this region, it became theirs. They were now going to be able to implement whatever way they want to. So they changed. Number one thing they do is they build plantations. The purpose of plantations are to grow cash crops and excrete the most amount of profits. Well, once you build the plantations, the indigenous economies collapse. Remember, I said the indigenous economies were based on no one owns anything. Things are animals roam where animals are going to roam. Well, in the plantations, once you build those fences, all of a sudden the land is owned by someone. It is now outside of the resources of the other people. And additionally, when I have these sugarcane plantations and I build those fences, animals are no longer going to roam. So it changes the elements of these economies as well as the environment. Second thing I want to point out is once you start plowing land, you now are never able to go back to pure nature, because once you plow the land, once you plow up the grassland and you cut down the rainforest and these things, the land now is dependent on humans to fertilize it. Once the humans leave, it will turn into a desert. It can be a wet desert, and we'll talk more about that later. But that's going to be the big thing about the plantation economies. It disrupts the indigenous economies because now there's ownership of land. Animals are not able to roam. They're going to become extinct, and it changes the actual environment as they begin to plow the land. Now, when we look at these islands, we identify them as quote unquote sugar factories. These were the sugar colonies. And we know that Christopher Columbus is the first who bumped into these islands. He claimed several of them for Spain. But once the Spanish begin their decline, the Dutch, the French, and the British are going to come in and claim ownership. And these sugar factories are going to take the sugar, raw sugar, and they're going to make tons and tons and tons of profit in Europe. Remember, I've already said sugar at one point was more valuable than gold, majorly valuable. And that's going to be what's run these. So all of the resources are going to be absorbed by the Europeans, and they're not going to replenish this area. So once the sugar factories no longer need to form, the Europeans leave, it's going to disrupt. There's going to be environmental crises that we're going to see throughout this region. I hope that makes sense. So once again, the sugar factories are these islands that were predominantly only going to be excreting the sugar into the European economies to fund them. So it's an economic thing. But as they were ultimately, it's going to destroy this area because they're going to absorb all of the resources without fixing it. And we'll see that later. Now, I also want to point out this region is going to be heavily impacted by the slave trade. The Africans in the Middle Passage, the majority, nearly the majority, a large number of slaves, between 40 to 50% of the slaves are going to come into this region. We already know that the Europeans' diseases killed off the Native Americans. That created a population crisis. The Europeans were not really excited about moving so far to the south. They thought it was too hot. So they're not going to colonize that region with people. So therefore, the answer was bring in the African slaves, the forced labor. And because of that, today's world, you're going to see a rich culture that develops in this area that's very multi-ethnic. You're going to have a touch of native, indigenous, Native Americans, but you're also going to see a wealth of African influences. So if you get a chance to see that, that's wonderful. But in the impact, or that's kind of talking about it from a more positive standpoint. In the end, though, I think I've pointed out enough destruction. If you have more questions, I will definitely answer those later.